So if tomorrow Prime Minister Modi were to call you,
I'd be like, what?
what would you suggest?
A lot of rich countries are pushing India to say, we worry about climate. You have to worry just as much about climate, and you have to put up a lot of solar panels and wind turbines and do all the stupid stuff that we're doing. You need to resist that. You need to say, no, I'm sorry.
Hello, Dr. Bjorn. Welcome to India.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So thank you so much for taking time to do this. I really appreciate it. I recently read your books, False Alarm and Best Things First. Both the books I read yesterday. And fantastic work, sir. I think you are one of the very few people across the world who have the sanest take on climate policies and climate change.
Thank you.
So I really wanted to talk to you about the climate alarmism because a lot of people, and you cite in your book one survey where they say that 58% young people think that it's a doomsday scenario, and we have been hearing since for the last 20-25 years that world is going to come to an end because of climate change. So I want your sane take on what's the reality check here.
Yeah. So it's a great start of a question. So fundamentally, climate change is a real problem, but it's by no means the end of the world. When people believe, and there's these surveys, there's an OECD survey that actually also surveyed India that showed that 83% of Indians believe that without strong climate action, it's likely or very likely that climate change will lead to the end of mankind. And it's just simply, no, that's not what the UN climate panel tells us at all. If you read they publish every 7 years or so, they publish like 1,600 pages of all the stuff that we know about climate change. I don't recommend to read it all. I haven't even read it.
That's why we have people like you.
Yes, but I've read most of it, and it's really good. And it tells us over and over again, here's a problem, not the end of the world. And this matters. Because if people think climate change is this meteor hurtling towards Earth and going to eradicate all of us a little bit like the dinosaurs, then obviously climate change is the only thing that matters. This is all that we should be concerned about. We should, for the age groups that make sense, we should send up Bruce Willis and the team to figure out this meteor. And that's all what we should be spending money on. All the problems on Earth sort of become almost trivial in comparison. That's not what climate change is. So climate economists have spent a long time looking at all of the different impacts on climate. And if you try to estimate all of them, remember, not everything is going to be bad. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of these things. But fundamentally, climate change means we get more heat waves, which is bad. It also means we get fewer cold waves, which is good. Overall, there are more bad things than good things. That's why climate change is a problem. Yeah. But if you try to estimate the whole thing and look out till 2100, it is likely that by the end of the century, because of 3-degree climate change, which is what we pretty much expect, the best estimates, so this is from the only guy who won the Nobel Prize in climate economics and one of the guys who are the most cited in climate economics, so William Nordhaus and Richard Tall, they both made estimates of all the different estimates of what will be the impact. They show that climate change is going to impact us. It'll feel like by the end of the century, we'll be 2 to 3% less well off than we otherwise would be.
Now, 2 to 3%.
2 to 3%. That is a real problem. So I would rather be 2 to 3% richer than not be 2 to 3% richer. But let's just put this in context, right? The UN estimate that by the end of the century, the average person on the planet will be 450% as rich as he or she is today. Indians will probably be like 900% richer. People like me or my descendants will be only 250% as rich. But fundamentally, this is a fantastically much better world in all kinds of ways. But because of climate change, because of the 2 to 3% reduction, it will feel like, instead of being 450% as rich, we will only feel like we're 435% or 440% as rich. Yes, that's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world. It's still a much better world, but it's a slightly less much better world. And now you're also realizing why it is that I'm not on the front pages of all papers, because this is a terrible argument. It's a problem but it simply means that progress happens slightly slower. That's a very, slow slogan, if you will. Everybody who says the world is ending, get all the front pages. But we need to get this right, because if we over-worry about climate, if we think this is the end of the world, we end up overspending on climate. And that, of course,
that's exactly what we are doing.
Exactly. And then we underspend and underworry about all the other problems that actually also matter, like the fact that people die from easily curable infectious diseases, and we have hunger still, we have lack of jobs, we have terrible education, we have corruption, we have all kinds of other problems across the world that we need to fix. And so if we can get it right on climate, we're also much more likely to get it right on all the other challenges.
But why do you think there is so much alarmism over this? Like, what do these people get from it?
So
just media, politicians, academicians, everybody.
So there's a lot of different things that sort of interlink here. One obvious thing is media love bad news. Media loves bad news because it sells. You click on bad stories. You tell people, would you want, if I give you a stack of good news and a stack of bad news, what would you read? People tell you, I would read the good news. Then you put them in the room by themselves and they read the bad news. We're like that. That's just how we are. And so obviously media gives us all those bad news clicks. We want to read on them. And if there's a fire, you send out a reporter and he'll be there. I'm out here reporting it. It's burning behind me. You never send out a reporter say, I'm here and it's not
Everything
burning.
is fine.
Yeah. So we constantly hear one side of the story, and we often hear a very exaggerated story. Remember, in the US over the last 3 decades, crime has gone down dramatically, according to all the official statistics from the FBI. But everybody in the US believes crime has increased. Why? Because at the same time, we got CNN and all the other 24/7 news channels. And they, of course, constantly tell you, oh my God, here's a crime, and here's another crime, and here's a third crime. So your experience is that it's just getting worse and worse. That's what we're getting a lot of.
And because people are living more and more in digital world, they feel that they are under siege.
And back in times of old, you saw your local environment, and maybe you heard about your uncle who lived 200 kilometers away. Today, you constantly see the worst thing that happened in the last 24 hours or last hour on your cell phone. Yeah. So obviously you think everything is getting worse and worse. But here's one statistic for you. If you look at the number of people dying from climate-related disasters, that's droughts, floods, storms, and wildfire. We have pretty good statistics for this for the last 100 years.
They are down by 90%.
They're down by 98%.
Okay.
So we've gone from a world in the 1920s of about 500,000 people dying each and every year. So on average, this fluctuates a lot, right? 500,000 people per year. Today, that number is down to 10,000, a little bit less than 10,000. So this is still terrible. 10,000 people are still a big problem, but it's fantastically much better than 500,000 people dying from. And of course, at the same time, the world has quadrupled in population. So what you've actually seen is your personal risk has dramatically diminished more than 99.4%.
But whenever some flood hits or whenever there is a hurricane, there is like a lot of reportage that this is the worst thing that has happened, and things are getting worse by the day, and so many people have died. So why we are getting all these reports when the facts are totally telling us different thing?
Because all of what you just said is true. There's this terrible hurricane and it killed all these people, and that's terrible. But you need to link it into, so how many people died from hurricanes this year compared to what happened before?
And why they died? Did that happen because of climate change?
Yes.
Or because of other factors? There is another point that you mention in your book.
There's absolutely another part of this conversation, but in some sense, I think it's almost making it too complicated. We know that there are fewer people dying. It's also important to say that a large part of this has nothing to do with climate. It's the fact that we're richer, we're more technologically advanced, and we're better able to tackle problems. So we have technology. We know how to fix many of these things that we didn't 100 years ago. This is fantastic. It may actually be that there's a tiny climate signal down below. So, of the 10,000 people that die each year, now maybe 2,000 of these people die from climate. But it's still a world where we've gone from 500,000 down to 10,000. And yes, and there's this tiny climate signal. But what you get the experience from the media is that it's all of this, and that it's not 10,000, but it feels like it's half the planet, or I don't know. It feels like it's an enormous number of people, and it's not.
But
the second, you also asked me, but it's important to say, yes, media is responsible, but obviously politicians also love to step into this for a number of reasons, because they get to say, and you have to say it in this very low American sort of advertisement voice, the world is ending, but if you vote for me, I can save you, right? I mean, this is what politicians have been doing since the time we started with politicking, right? This is what you fear. You get people to fear stuff, and then you say, but I'm the solution. Vote for me. And this works. I mean, it does work. And then, of course, at the same time, if you get everybody to worry a lot about climate change, you get to spend a lot of money on climate change. And this is what we're doing. Last year, we spent 2.1 trillion US dollars. So that's, 2.1 lakh crore dollars every year. And we're set to spend more. A lot of this is not spent well, but it means you get to spend a lot of money on your friends.
But it also works because people want to feel that they are trying to do something bigger than themselves and nothing bigger than the planet, right? Yeah. So they also feel that they are part of some activism.
Yes.
That makes them feel important, right? That is another big problem.
Absolutely. You want to feel like your life has meaning. You want to leave the world a better place. And one of the things that I keep trying to say is, that's wonderful. I love the fact that you want to do better for this world. But let's just look at the data. If you focus on cutting carbon emissions, if you focus on putting up a solar panel or something, you will have spent quite a bit of money, and you will have done almost nothing for the world in 100 years. With all the other problems that are in the world, hunger, bad education, and health, all these things, you could have spent the same amount of money and done an incredible amount of good. Oh, and you could have done it now instead of in 100 years. So, of course, you will help make the future even better. The point here is, if we can't do everything, and let's be realistic, we can't do everything, we should do the best things first, not the worst things first. And it seems like we're much more focused on doing something that makes us feel good and warm and fuzzy inside, instead of actually doing the stuff that does do good.
Yeah, we were talking about floods, hurricanes, and droughts. So you give a lot of examples in your book that you give examples in, I think, US also, in Bangladesh also, and in India also it happens that when we look at these incidents, what we see as deaths or what we see as devastation, it is not entirely due to climate change, but because of other things. So can you give those examples? Because that is also important to put these things in context.
Yes. So obviously, when you have floods, people love to sort of flock to the idea, say, oh, this is climate change. But the reality, of course, is a very large part of any kind of flood will happen because you have made bad changes to your infrastructure. So if you have many more people, if you paved over most of your city, which happens in a lot of big cities, and we've seen that perhaps most blatantly in Houston and in Texas, where they basically just cemented the whole city, you shouldn't be surprised that then when it rains, you get a lot of trouble. But of course, the politicians who are responsible for this, so take Pakistan, the huge floods that were there a couple of years ago. Everybody said it's climate change, and look, climate change probably played a part in this, but the vast majority of the cost was because Pakistan has invested almost nothing in water infrastructure the last 20 years. But of course, if I'm responsible for the water infrastructure, I'd much rather blame it on climate change and say, oh, it's the evil Westerners, than saying I'm an idiot. But the reality is, no, you were probably an idiot if you were responsible for Pakistan's water infrastructure, and you should be fired. Yeah. And this is why, again, climate change is such a convenient scapegoat, because you both get to get lots of funding, you get politicians voted, you also get to escape responsibility, and you get to feel this warm and fuzzy, I'm doing good for the planet. Again, this does not take away from climate change is a problem, but the way we make it into this all-dominating problem makes it for really, really bad decision-making.
And it makes us focus on things that are not as bad. For example, you mentioned in your book that people who die from cold, There's a 9 times higher than people who are dying from heat waves.
Yeah, yeah.
But we only hear about the heat wave because that is like global warming narrative, right?
Yeah.
But we don't hear about the cold deaths.
It's so amazing to me that we know from research across the world that many, many more people die from cold than die from heat. This is true even in India. So I actually gave this presentation this morning to the finance ministry. Right? We have good studies for India. So about 25,000 people die from extreme heat in India every year. That's terrible. And a very large part of it is because they don't have access to air conditioning, and possibly we should make sure they can afford to do that. But it also needs to be put in perspective. Almost 50,000 people die from extreme cold in India every year, so twice as many. And if you also include the moderate heat, which is about another 80,000, and moderate cold, which kills, and hold on to your chair, 586,000 people in India each year.
But how come moderate cold is killing more people than extreme cold?
So, because we spend much more time in moderate cold. Extreme cold only happens in a few days, just like extreme heat only happens in a few days. It's very deadly when it happens, but it only happens in a few days.
And we are more careful there.
Yes, and typically you'll be careful because you'll have heard about it and there'll be warnings on TV and all that stuff. But moderate cold and moderate heat kills you more because you're not really all that aware. But when with moderate cold, what happens is that you're a little cold, you're a little uncomfortable, but perhaps not enough to turn up the heat. Especially if you're a little poor, you want to sort of conserve your heat. So maybe you sleep a little cold. What happens over the whole winter time is that your body will slightly cool on the surface, and it'll contract the blood to your core, so you'll survive. But that also increases your blood pressure, and that's one of the best ways to die. We know that this is what brings on a lot of strokes and heart attacks. And so, again, this is not about rocket science. It's simply about saying, if we weren't so focused just on climate change, again, climate change will mean we will see more heat waves. That's bad. But it also means we'll see fewer cold waves, which is good. You need to say both. And you need to look at both. And just one more point. What really sort of drives me up the wall is, what's the solution to both of these things, both heat death and cold death?
Yeah, that was my next question.
Oh, thank you. Then I'll answer it without you even asking. The answer is cheap energy, right? That you have access to air conditioning when it's warm, and that you have access to heating when it's cold. Unfortunately, much of climate policy does the exact opposite. It makes it more expensive to have electricity and energy in general, because you have to have different energy sources that emit less CO2. And that's well-intentioned, but the side effect of that is that you end up being able to less well defend yourself, both from heat waves and from cold waves, and you end up dying more. That's a terrible outcome. And so again, this warm, fuzzy feel that you have when you say, let's do more climate policy, sort of ignores the fact that, and kill more people. But we never say that because it doesn't sound so cool, right?
So what are we doing wrong as far as India is concerned when it comes to, focus on energy? I know that India is kind of obsessed with solar. I think we have set a target of 500 gigawatts to achieve by 2030 by renewables. So how do you see all that? I think there's a lot of effort is going because Prime Minister's pet project. This is Prime Minister's pet project. And what happens in countries like India is when there is executive is making this decision, then whole state machinery, starts to function to respond to that. So a lot of resources, lot of time, lot of energy is spent in that. So how do you see India's focus on renewables rather than say nuclear and other things?
Yes. So I'm just going to make a big fat disclaimer first. I'm not an expert on India's energy system. So I'm going to give some general answers to this. Also, there's something wrong about a guy coming from Denmark, random guy coming from Denmark and telling Indians what you should be doing. But fundamentally, there's a lot of push across the world to go for more solar and wind. And it feels good. And remember, there is some sense in this. A lot of people will tell you that solar and wind has come down dramatically in price over the last couple of decades. That's absolutely true. So when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing, it can be some of the cheapest electricity you can produce on the planet. The problem is, most of our societies don't just run when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. We actually want power 24/7. And that's a huge problem. If you buy solar and buy wind and say, oh, it's really cheap when it's running, but then you have to have backup power for the whole thing when it's not running.
Storage.
You're stuffed. Well, storage is actually probably the most expensive way to do this. So just to give you a sense of proportion, we estimate, so this is a recent period paper for the US, that if you actually want to let the US go entirely on wind or entirely on solar, you have to prepare not just for obvious things that it's night, but you also have to prepare for what happens when it's extended periods of cloudy and there's not, in the wintertime when there's not all that much sun, all that stuff. It turns out you need so much storage that you need storage for the equivalent of 3 months of the US electricity production. 3 months is a long time. It's not overnight or something. It's a long time. Just to give you a sense of proportion, the US right now has about 10 minutes in battery storage. So you would need to dramatically ramp this up many, many thousands of times. And the literal cost of this would be about 1/3 of the US GDP every year.
Crazy.
And of course, you have to re-put them up, and we estimate they'll last about 15 years. So you'd basically have to pay for this for the rest of the century. And of course, you're not going to get there. That's why the reality is that you are more likely to just simply buy backup power from fossil fuels of some kind. Obviously, if you have hydro, that's great, but that only works for some places and some situations. So the real point here is it ends up making your total energy system much more expensive. Although the sort of the nice soundbite is, oh, it's cheaper than anything else. Yes, when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, but other times it's infinitely expensive. Imagine if I asked you, or told you, hey, I have this great solar-driven car. It's cheaper than your regular fossil fuel car. Would you want that? Your sort of initial reaction, well, sure, that sounds great, until you realize you can only drive it when it's sunny. You can't drive it at night. You can't drive it if it's overcast. So you actually need to buy 2 cars. So you have to have one car that you can drive when it's sunny and the car for all the other times.
That's actually happening with EV cars.
A little bit. And so what is the reality is, yes, you're saving a little bit on gas, which is nice, but having to buy 2 cars makes it real obvious for everyone. Oh yeah, that's not actually a good idea. Unfortunately, that's much what we're doing. Now, I'll give you that Modi might be right to a certain point. So we know from California, for instance, that the highest peak of electricity consumption is during the day when it's very sunny, which is typically when it's very hot, which is when you need air conditioning. So that's perfect for solar because that's exactly when solar will be producing electricity. So there's an argument of saying those peak you can actually power with solar power. That's great because you need power for your air conditioning exactly when solar is producing it. That's 10% or something of your electricity in California. So the first 10% might actually be a good idea, but everybody wants to go way past that. And then, of course, it becomes just a really bad idea. So what I would suggest is that instead of saying we want to do this for the world, we need to do accurate cost-benefit analysis and say, well, how much is this going to cost? How much good is it going to do? And what we often find is climate policies end up being very costly and deliver fairly little benefit only far out into the future. So again, if you actually want to do good, there's so many other things you could have done first.
What do you think about fracking in India? Because our 70%, I think, energy comes from coal and very minutely from nuclear, I think 2 to 3%. So we need to focus on alternative energy sources and the imports that we have of energy, of fuel, that is very expensive.
Yeah.
So what do you think about fracking?
So I should just again mention, I'm not a geologist, so I don't know whether it's going to work. But let's just look at what the US has done. The US basically allowed fracking. And remember, fracking, just like any other technology has downsides. So it leads to some local pollution, although not nearly as much as what you've heard, because again, it makes for a lot better stories when you talk about all the bad things that can happen, and actually makes for more air pollution. But the biggest estimate that we've made, sort of the biggest study that has been made, suggests that the total impact is in the order of minus $25 billion in negative outcomes from fracking. So that's a real problem, but about a positive impact in the terms of cheaper energy and more GDP growth in the US of about $187 billion. So the benefits are much, much greater than the costs. And of course, what's happened with the US emissions is because they have incredibly cheap gas, they have been able to switch away from coal, use gas instead, which emits about half as much CO2.
So their emissions are way down.
Their emissions have gone down more than any other country in the world, not because of Obama's climate policies, not because of Trump's, sort of, I don't want to do anything about climate. I can't do the Trump voice.
Drill, baby, drill.
But it's much more by switching from coal to gas. These are simple things that work incredibly well. So if India could frack, you should frack. And again, because it's a great boost both to your economy. We know that it's much better than the problems that it resolves. And obviously, there are some real problems, and we need to fix them because, again, remember, there are problems with everything.
True.
And it will actually reduce your emissions probably much more than anything else you could do.
So we were talking about aggressive policies that, Paris climate change, Paris climate agreement that we have. So they have very aggressive policies, and it costs around $2 trillion per year to us, right?
So right now we're spending a little more than $2 trillion. But
what will be the goal? Where will we be by, say, 2100?
Yeah. So first of all, it's incredibly important to remember, unless the whole world is on board, which it isn't, this is always just going to be a poverty exercise for Europe and maybe for the U.S. But it seems like with Donald Trump, it may just be for Europe, which obviously is just the saddest outcome ever. So essentially, Europe is going to make itself impoverished. And the net effect, if you run the UN climate model, by the middle of the century, you will not be able to measure the difference. By the end of the century, we will have, managed to reduce temperatures by the end of the century by 0.08 degrees Celsius. So we will literally, after having spent about $100 trillion and impoverished ourselves, nobody will be able to notice. That's just a bad idea. And again, this goes to the fundamental point of saying climate change cannot be solved by saying to everyone, I'm sorry, would you mind to be a little poor, a little less comfortable, a little colder in the winter and warmer in the summer, and no, you can't drive as much, and no, you can't fly, you can't have meat, you can't do all the things you like. Would you be okay with that? And do you think we could get everybody else on the planet to go along with that for decades on end? No, you're not going to get. People will vote for Donald Trump, essentially, right? And so the reality is, you need to find a smarter way forward. So I helped assemble a group of 50 of the world's top climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, and we tried to look at where can you actually spend a rupee and do the most good for climate. And the simple answer is no, it's not by mandating lots of solar panels or wind turbines or all these other things that are fairly costly and doesn't do very much good. The only real solution, and this has been the solution for pretty much all problems in the world, is to innovate. So invest a lot more money in green energy R&D. Remember, if we could innovate the next generation of, say, nuclear power plants to be much cheaper, remember, right now they're not, but if we could make them much cheaper than anything else, they emit no CO2, and if we could make them very safe, everyone would buy them, not because they were forced to by climate zealots, but because it was cheaper. Yeah. So if we can innovate a technology to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we're done.
But that is not sexy enough.
It's totally not sexy. It happens to be much, much cheaper. So remember, right now we're spending about $2 trillion. We're going to go much further than that. And it's also going to have a lot of indirect costs because it's going to slow growth. Instead, what we're estimating is we should be spending about $100 billion, so about 5% of what we're spending right now, on innovation. That would still be a quadrupling of what we're doing right now. But because researchers are cheap and stuff is expensive, putting up lots of solar panels that we know still don't work, expensive. Paying for researchers to come up with the next idea, cheap. Remember, back in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people worried about a lot of the world not being able to feed itself. I mean, people were arguing for, India was just going to be a basket case. We'd just have to let them die, and because there's no way you can feed yourself. No. What was the solution was not to tell everyone, I'm sorry, would you mind to eat a little less, and then we'll just spread it out all over the world.
That's exactly what was happening. People were being asked to eat less.
Well, that's the environmentalist solution, right? But the real solution was the Green Revolution.
True.
We had scientists find ways to get much more out of each hectare of land. That's the way you solve these sorts of problems. And of course, today, India is the world's leading rice exporter. You're not a basket case anymore. You are exactly the example of what happens if you focus on innovation. You can get great results and you can get everybody on board. Unlike the other solution, which is to say, can we impoverish everyone and then see if we can sort of solve it? And nobody's going to go along. Well, unfortunately, Europe still, but eventually we'll get sick and tired of it as well.
Yeah, we'll come to the smart policies that you outline in your book later. But first, I will tell you some of the stupid policies in India that we are following. I don't know how much they work, but they seem stupid to me, at least. Yeah. Just for people in the comments who will call me stupid. So, for example, you
think it's going to stop them from calling you stupid?
Yeah, of course not. So, for example, we have a single-use plastic ban. We have paper straws now instead of plastic straws, which is the most idiotic thing. And then we have... ethanol blending, we are increasing from 10% to 20%. We are basically outlawing all the vehicles that are older than 15, petrol vehicles older than 15, and diesel vehicles older than 10 years. So these are the things, and we have smog towers, to suck up all the CO2, which don't work. Because no matter how much big tower that you install, you are not going to reduce 10,000 AQI in peak winters in Delhi to say ideal conditions. So I think we spend a lot of time on all these kind of things and don't focus on real solutions. For example, stubble burning, massive farm fires that happen in October, November in Punjab, Haryana, and that causes a lot of pollution. So because that is politically, that is very challenging to tackle. You can't ask farmers or you can't ban them from burning their stubble because they have to clear it and they have to plant fresh crop. So, but apart from all these, why don't we focus on smart solutions? For example, why don't we focus on innovation?
So the single-use plastic and the straw ban
what do you
is
think
sort
about
of
that?
The most obviously stupid policy. Look, I mean, first of all, anyone who have ever used a paper straw knows
absolutely,
they don't work.
I hate it.
It's just a terrible idea. But it's also a very, very great example of how we focus on these small, really just symbolic efforts. Plastic straws are just not what's going to doom the planet, and just to give you a sense of background, when we started worrying a lot about plastics in the ocean, the real problem is not from well-functioning municipal garbage systems that we have in the West and that you also increasingly have here in India. It is from countries that just simply dump it in the ocean. Now, who dumps this in the ocean? Well, it turns out that a lot of it came from recycled plastic in the rich countries that we ship to places like China and Vietnam and other places to get it handled. But of course, when the barge came down to Vietnam and they were sort of like, so should we handle all of this or should we accidentally dump it in the ocean? And, not surprisingly, a lot of, less than savory countries decided to dump it. We know that that's where most of it came from. So it actually came from really well-intentioned people wanting to recycle, but not being willing to pay for the full price of recycling. Most of the plastic in the ocean today come from fishing equipment. So about 70, 80% of it comes from it. Nothing comes from plastic straws. Plastic straws don't make it into the ocean.
Where did this policy came from? Like, it is very important to understand where do these policies come from?
My understanding of that is, I haven't done a full investigation on this, but my understanding is that it was a 14-year-old student in the U.S. That tried to look at how many plastic straws you use every year, and it just turned. It was one of those irresistible stories for all newspapers to say, "Oh, there's," and obviously if you multiply it out, it must be billions of plastic straws, and that sounds like a bad idea. And I worry about plastic in the ocean. Plastic straws. No, we got to do something. Plastic, we got to get rid of it. And it's one of those things that you can actually mandate, right? Because it's not life-saving equipment. It's not a car. It's not like something you could actually imagine that you could sort of replace it with a paper straw. And then it feels like we spent a year and that's all we've talked about, but now we've made a difference. No, you haven't. You've just made a stupid decision. But it's a very clever way of seeing how we get sort of engineered with these false and honestly mathematically illiterate arguments. And so we need to do better. On the biodiesel, that's just one of those things where you're, oh my God, why are you doing that? So we obviously started doing this in the US. They're now taking most of their corn crop, so maize crop, and producing it into gasoline fuel, which is just a terrible way. So the argument is that it's good for the environment, that it's mostly good for because it has lower greenhouse emissions. That's a very tenuous argument. A lot of people suggest that actually, if you look at the real impact, because you drive up the price of food, which means that you need to increase food production elsewhere, which means you cut down forests, which means you've just emitted a lot of CO2 plus cut down the rainforest. Congratulations. But the reason why we don't get rid of it is because it's great for Iowa farmers in the US. And they're the guys who do the first primary. So every president in the US have always been saying, yeah, I'm going to go along and give you even more of this. And I suspect that it's a little bit the same thing in India.
I think ethanol blending in India is increasing because we have to manage all that stubble. To solve that stubble problem, that we will divert that into ethanol, and farmers will also benefit, and we will have less air pollution. But we are diverting it to...
And look, it may be a good idea then, if it's actually part of you, because you also ask for the solution for air pollution. Again, one of the things that drive me up the wall is everybody seems to be incredibly worried about plastics in the ocean, which is, yes, a problem for several turtles. But, fundamentally, most of the environmental problems and by far the biggest environmental problem in the world is outdoor and indoor air pollution. Because people don't live in the ocean, they live on land, typically in cities. Why is it we focus so much on plastic pollution in the ocean and not on air pollution? And again, one of the simple things we know, so about 2 billion people cook and keep warm. A lot of people also in India, but I can't remember the
I think on that front, we have a revolution in the last 10 years because Prime Minister Modi has personally, his pet project was to give LPG cylinders to every household. So I think we have revolutionized that part of thing.
You have part of it, but I also remember when we did the analysis on this, a lot of people get the first cylinder for free, but they can't afford to keep doing it. And so they'll actually go back and still do this indoor. But the fundamental problem is, this is a problem of poverty. This is where you really need to make sure that if you get people out of poverty, you solve one of the most important environmental problems, namely indoor air pollution, which for about 2 billion people is, according to the World Health Organization, equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes each and every day, because they cook and keep warm with dirty fuels like wood, dung, cardboard. So again, poverty reduction is not just a solution for a lot of obvious things. It's good to not be poor. But it's also an environmental solution. And, of course, if you get people out of poverty, they'll also be much less vulnerable to a lot of the climate impacts. So this is one of those solutions where we really should be much more careful to say, that's one of the things we need to do. And, of course, one of the things that will come out of that is not just that we will make people richer, but that we will also care much more about our economy and say, well, what is actually the impact of some of our climate policies? that is to make us less well off in the future because we're artificially driving up the price of energy being one of the prime movers of our economy. So we really have to be careful that we don't, in our attempt to try to be good and say, oh, we got to do something for the environment and climate, that we end up actually making the world much worse in many different ways. And I think that is unfortunately what often happens.
I just remembered a couple of more stupid policies that we have.
And you want to get them out, yes.
One is that we have a construction ban in Delhi, NCR, basically Delhi and Haryana and some parts of Uttar Pradesh, all these areas, during winters. Whenever there is a spike in pollution, we ban construction.
Wow.
Yeah. So things like that.
And again, I mean, I don't know how to solve the air pollution problem. And clearly, smart minds ought to look into that. And it may be that you ask all the farmers
And
for the stubble.
odd even. We have an odd even policy.
Right, I heard about that. Yeah.
That's how crazy it is.
Yeah.
Instead of focusing on real solutions, that's what we are doing.
But it also speaks to the fundamental point of innovation. In Los Angeles in the 1950s, it was terribly, terribly polluted. It was one of those things that everybody worried about, and child doctors were saying it's terrible. Our kids have asthma, all this stuff because of Los Angeles have lots of cars. And they have this geographical situation that it often sort of gets stuck in the valley of Los Angeles. But the solution, again, was not to do an odd even policy or tell all people in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, would you mind walking instead? No, the solution was a catalytic converter. It cost a couple $100. You put it on the tail of your end of your tailpipe, and then you can drive as long as you will and almost not pollute. This is the kind of thing that we need to find. And again, there are a lot of different ways to skin this cat, but we need to ask the hard questions. How much will it cost? How much good will it do? And then you can find the smart things that will actually have a big impact. In some cities, that is to make a lot of the scooters electric. Unlike electric cars, which are often a bad idea, electric scooters, because the battery to hold weight is much, much less, you can actually much more easily switch to electric scooters, and it gets you more drive, it gets you cheaper drive, and you get no pollution from this. That could be the solution. Again, I don't know whether it would be.
So what you are saying is basically economic growth is the best solution going for countries like India, because what we see in China also, like 15 years back, we had news reports of Beijing looking like Delhi, what Delhi looks today in winters, right? So 15 years down the line, we can also improve on these things. But most important is we should not be hurting our economic growth.
No. So it's important to say economic growth is not going to fix all things. So you still need to fix other things. But economic growth has two important properties. It allows individuals to fix a lot more of their own problems. So it really very, very basically allows poor people to buy food for their kids, to make sure that they're not sick, to get a better education for them, and allow you for all these other things that make your life better. And it allows for the state to have more resources to fix the remaining problems. Yeah. But you still need to, it sounds very, silly if you just say, oh, growth, and then don't care about anything else. But growth is an incredibly important thing. And I think your point with China is exactly. China is just in a much better place because they've lifted everybody out of poverty, and they've gotten people up to what is it, $10,000 or thereabouts. It's just an astounding achievement. And we should all be in awe of this. There's a lot of other problems in China, but that is an amazing thing, and they've done a huge benefit for mankind. That is what everybody should be aiming at going. Right?
One of the great ideas in your book is carbon tax. So when you look at India, what are some things that we should be, taxing? We should have carbon tax for that will give the best bang for the buck.
So a carbon tax is a reasonably good policy. It's not a great policy or anything, but because it has a lot of cost. If you increase the tax, obviously the money doesn't go away, but it makes for a less efficient economy. So it has a real cost, but because carbon or CO2 emissions is also a real problem, you're solving some of the problem at a fair cost. We estimate that for every rupee you spend, that is lost GDP growth, lost growth, you do 2 rupees of climate benefits. So that's nice. You should do that. The beauty of a carbon tax is that if you put it across, and this is, something that you can fairly easily do, you put it across all the fossil fuels that you use, and then basically you and I and everybody else don't have to worry. It's included in the price. So when, you want to go somewhere, but you don't really want it all that much, you'll not go because, it's, the petrol is a little more costly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it'll also sometimes be where you could have been very productive. You won't go because, the petrol is more expensive. So there are real costs, but can be a good investment. But of course, the real point here is, if you do a carbon tax, first of all, it has to be a realistic carbon tax, which is a fairly low one, not these amazingly high numbers that people talk about. Never happen.
Smartly, you have to do.
Smart, yeah. The second one is, if you've done a carbon tax, economic theory tells you then you should do away with everything else. You should not have a prime minister that says we need 200 gigawatts of solar, or that we should have this, or that we should have that, or that we should have subsidies for solar or wind or for anything else, because it's all built in to the carbon tax. So you do the carbon tax, do away with everything else, and you're good to go. So that's how you fix climate change in the very specific sort of technocratic sense. But, and this is what is incredibly important, much, much more effectively is to focus on innovation. So there's always an underinvestment in innovation in all kinds of areas. Remember, in India and everywhere else, we spend a lot of public money on health, on researchers that basically do blue sky research that'll eventually lead to some of these guys getting a Nobel Prize. But eventually that will lead to Pfizer being able to make this into a product that will make us all healthier, but will also make Pfizer a lot of money. That's how the innovation economy works. Pfizer doesn't do this because if they invested in all these smart ideas, many of them wouldn't work out, but eventually one of them would. But, the patent would have run out by then, and so they can't actually do it. That's why it's a public benefit to have innovation that the public needs to fund. We know this in healthcare. We should do the same thing in energy. That was what we talked about earlier. We should be spending, say, $100 billion on research and development into green energy. This is by far the best investment that we could do. By all means, do a carbon tax as well. What I find is that in a lot of countries, it's hard to get it right. It's hard to get it through, and it gets a lot of politicians into all kinds of weird corners, and it's not all that much of a solution. So sure, if you can make it, but the best and the most likely solution to climate change is absolutely innovation.
What are some areas that you would recommend that India should focus on when it comes to innovation and R&D?
So again, the point of innovation is that we don't know what the future looks like. If I knew what was going to win the 21st century, I'd be a much richer man. But nobody really does, right? We just have hunches and ideas. So
for example, agriculture, energy.
So I'm going to give you a few of the. Sorry. So this is not for climate. You're asking in general?
No, climate only.
Climate. Okay. Yes.
General will come to later.
On climate, we should be investing in all of these areas. Realistically, different countries will do different things.
Because you do so much research on BCR. Yeah. So that's why I'm asking
the fundamental point is that because researchers are so cheap, you can do a lot of different things. Now, you basically try to do, set up blue ribbon commissions that will go in and say, what are the kind of breakthroughs we need for the next 10 or 20 years? So we need solar to come down to this price. We need to get nuclear, small modular reactors to get down here. And we need this sort of breakthrough and we need that breakthrough. And then you make funding just like you do in the National Science Academies, where you basically give funding to people who are doing specific research that promises a breakthrough. Just to give you a sense of proportion. So, Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000, he has this slightly ridiculous idea, but, it works. He says, imagine if we put this genetically modified algae out on the ocean surface. Out there, it'll soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. Basically, all countries in the world, so India could just grow its own Saudi Arabia out on the ocean surface, and we would just harvest all the oil. We could keep our entire fossil fuel infrastructure, and we could now run it with no CO2 emissions because it will all come from that oil that soaked up the CO2 out on the ocean surface a couple of months ago. Now, this works in principle. It is not at all commercially available
And can
right
damage the ocean ecosystem also.
now. Oh, I'm sure we should certainly be looking at that.
So that's why we have to research on that.
Oh, absolutely. But no, mostly we need to do research on saying, can we get that price down? And the point is, there's 1,000 of those kinds of ideas, and we just need one of them to come through.
Yeah.
So we should be funding a lot of those research projects. Most of them are going to fail. That's the nature of innovation. But a few of them will come through. Those are the ones that will power the 21st century. And if you can guess them, you will be very rich too. But look, I don't know. So the point here is, that's how we should be spending our money. So absolutely, we should be focusing on getting more of these energy sources. We should also be focusing, you mentioned agriculture. By far the best way is to focus on getting higher yields. Now, some of that research, and a lot of research right now, goes into finding varieties that'll be better able to handle drought or better able to handle salinity. That's nice. But what we have to remember is, again, the vast majority of the problem in world's agricultural production is that the yield gap between what most people produce and what you can produce in that area is vast. And so when you're talking about the climate change impact, which is sort of a couple percent of this, that's nice. But what you really want is to get everybody else, all the farmers, up on the level that research stations in that area are already producing. So that's about getting better pesticides, better fertilizer, better varieties, better, and this is crucial, better management, which a lot of farmers still, they do it the way their fathers did. You need to get this updated. Maybe you need to plant at a different time, maybe different crops altogether. There are all kinds of these things. So extension services, there's a lot of things that make a lot of sense, but they're not sexy again. And they don't refer back to this one issue of climate change. They just refer back to the idea of, let's make us all better off, which of course actually will end up making the world a much better place, but doesn't feel nearly as sexy.
So if tomorrow Prime Minister Modi were to call you and,
I'd be like, what?
and if you had to give him some suggestions that these are the 10 policies as far as climate is concerned, what would you suggest? Prioritization.
So first of all, I would say, sorry, I'll come back to you in half a year with, there's no way I could come up with, that list on,
but
on
given,
the fly. But
given the research that you
given
have
that
done
you're
on
asking
India.
me now.
Yeah.
So I would say something along the lines of, you should be investing a lot more in green energy research and development. This is crucial for two reasons. Partly because it's the right solution for climate, but also because a lot of rich countries are pushing a lot of rich countries are pushing India to say, we worry about climate, you have to worry just as much about climate, and you have to put up a lot of solar panels and wind turbines and do all the stupid stuff that we're doing. You need to resist that. You need to say, no, I'm sorry, we have a lot of poor people. We actually want to get them out of poverty, and that's possibly our first priority. We also have a lot of people dying from easily curable infectious diseases. We have some pretty bad education stuff. We want to do a lot of this basic stuff. Absolutely. So if you could say, we're actually doing the smart climate policy, which, by the way, is what you should be doing too. We're focusing on finding the future technological breakthroughs that will actually power the world's future. That's what we're doing. What are you doing? We're not going to do your stupid stuff. We're going to do the smart stuff. That would insulate you from a lot of the, sort of the shaming and also the veiled threats of protectionism from rich countries. And it would be the right thing to do. Oh, and it would possibly also help the rich countries to become smarter. So that's by far the most important thing that you should be doing. Then you should also be saying, all right, if I actually care about climate change, I should ask myself, how do I best address it? Well, you address it by making sure that people know what's the reality. So stop the fear mongering. There's something terrible about our kids being scared witless. There's something terrible about 83% of Indians believing.
These have real consequences.
Yeah.
People are not willing to have kids because of this.
Oh, yeah. And just, there's something wrong about being badly informed, but there's also something wrong about worrying about stuff that's not actually real. This is terrible. So, but it also leads to bad political outcomes. So get the fear factor right. Then also make sure that we focus on adaptation. So most of the problems from climate change and from anything else is going to be fixed by adaptation. Remember, temperatures fluctuate all the time. You don't say, oh my God, we got to do something about it by changing the whole energy infrastructure because it's now too cold outside. You get a heater. And likewise, when it's really hot, you get an air conditioner. I'm not saying that this is, sort of in a facile sense that this is the only solution, but this is the obvious solution. If you may have heard of this, in Europe in 2003, there was a huge heat wave that killed a lot of people. We estimate it killed somewhere between 75 and 150,000 people across Europe. A lot of them died in Paris, in Paris, France. This was mostly elderly people that were left alone in their apartments and just died because it was too hot. So people were saying, "Oh my God, this is terrible," which it was. We should make climate policies, and I'm almost like, what? So you're basically saying that we want to honor these old Parisians who died from too much heat. We're going to honor them by making climate policies that will mean it'll still get much warmer by the end of the century, but slightly less much warmer. So we'll make sure that slightly less, much more old people are going to die in Paris, France. That's a terrible idea. Why don't we, I don't know, get them air conditioning so they stop dying? And of course, in reality, that was what France and a lot of other nations did. We actually put in air conditioners in old people's homes. And it turns out in 2015, when there was a much bigger heat wave, almost no people died. Because we know how to fix this. So this is the kind of thing that the Prime Minister should be focusing on. And then the last bit, and sorry,
on this, I want to say on adaptation front, the best example we have is of Odisha. We used to have terrible cyclones there, and a lot of people, thousands of people used to die. Yeah. But I think that in 1919, it was a devastation. But now we have so many protocols, so many things we have improved, that nobody dies now.
Yeah. We did a work in Bangladesh, which in 1971 had the world's worst hurricane that killed 300,000 people. And today, of course, virtually nobody dies, just like you said. So we went there and we thought we were going to talk about how we are going to avoid people dying. No, they were like, no, we want our cows to not die. Which, of course, is wonderful that we've gotten to the point where we no longer worry about the humans, we worry about the cows. Cool. So this is a great thing, and that happens from adaptation. Then the final thing that I would tell the Prime Minister in this very first call would be that we need to focus on poverty alleviation. We need to focus on growth. Because remember, a lot of people will tell you that poor people are harmed the most from climate change. That's absolutely true. But remember, poor people are harmed most by anything because it sucks being poor.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, you need to get people out of poverty. If you get people out of poverty, they'll be much less vulnerable to hurricane. They'll be much less vulnerable to flood. They'll be much less vulnerable to droughts and all these other things. Oh, and they will be much less vulnerable to disease and hunger and bad education and all these other things. Poverty reduction is just a magic thing that makes most things much better. Not everything, but if you're poor, you certainly want poverty reduction first. And I'm sure that Modi knows this, but if he could sort of focus even more of his attention on this, because he could now relax a little bit on the climate front, that would be amazing.
Yeah, because in the last 10 years, he has actually focused a lot on Human Development Index and indicators, and he has a lot of policies that are actually focused on improving the lives of the poor people. Yeah. But from the second book that you have, the latest one, Best Things First. So what policies that you would suggest that are relevant to India that would, if you were to talk to the Prime Minister, what would you say that the government should focus on?
Yes. So with this book, we looked at basically, you may know, there's a lot of people who don't, that the world has promised and India has promised something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which is essentially we promised all good things in the world to everyone all the time, which of course is just a silly thing.
200 goals?
There's 169 targets. The Economist made fun of it and said it's the 169 commandments. I mean, there's a reason why Moses didn't come down the mountain with 169 tablets with all the different things that we should be doing. Yeah, that makes no sense. sense. If you promise, 169 promises, it's like promising nothing. So instead of promising everything and actually achieving very little, we should focus on where can you spend a rupee and do an immense amount of good. We haven't done this specifically for India, but we've done it for low and low middle income countries. And I believe, at least I'll tell you some of the things that I think would be incredibly useful.
Because
for
in
India.
each chapter, there are such beautiful data points that you have taken from India.
Thank
so
you.
I have to thank you for that.
Yes. Well, I mean, India is one of the biggest countries in the world. So obviously, this is an
Because
important part
most
of
of those
conversation.
data points people don't know even in India.
Well, there you go. Well, read the book. But anyway, so the idea here is, again, let me give you one health and one non-health. So the non-health is education. So education almost everywhere in the world sucks. I mean, in the sense that we get a lot of people in schools, but they don't learn nearly as much as they should. And so in India and lower middle income countries, education has a real crisis. So we work together with Noam Angrist, who's one of the world's leading education economists at the Oxford
I was really
University.
surprised to note that you have mentioned Right to Education Act that we passed in 2009.
Yeah.
And we focus so much on inputs. Like
Yes.
it should have that many classrooms, they should have science lab, computer lab, rather than outcomes.
Yeah.
But now the Modi government is actually focusing on the
wonderful.
outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because obviously, the point of an educational system is not to have a lot of classrooms or a lot of happy teachers. It's to have students who learn.
Yeah.
And so the problem here is, and I think while India is doing a lot better than a lot of low and low middle income countries, on average, we estimate 79% of all kids at the age of 10 have no functional ability to read. And this in India is still 56% of all kids. This is not a way to drive a 21st century economy. Now, the problem here is, how do you fix this? And as you pointed out, a lot of politicians and presumably India before would also say, well, we should spend a lot more money. So Indonesia actually did that. Indonesia, much to their credit, decided we're going to spend twice as much money on education. They actually put it in their constitution. So in the early 2000s, they upped their spending so much that they went from 2.7 to 3.8 million teachers. They hired more than a million more teachers, and they paid each one of these teachers twice as much money. Because of the way it was done, so it happened in different regions at different times. You could actually make what's called a pseudo-randomized controlled trial study, so you could see how effectful was this on student learning. And this is one of the most quoted education economic papers. It's called Double for Nothing. So unfortunately, it had no impact on student learning. Now, it did make the teachers much happier, which you would sort of expect. But that's not the relevant outcome of an educational system. But of course, if you ask most teachers, what should we do? They will tell you, well, pay us more or hire more teachers. I totally understand that. If I was a teacher, I'd say the exact same thing. But we need to ask what actually works. And so I'm going to tell you the two things that we know not only work, but works amazingly and at very cheap rate. The first one is learn at the right level. So the real problem in a classroom, say 6th grade, is that you have lots of kids at very different levels. So some of these kids are at 6th grade, but many of them are not. Most of them will probably be in 3rd or 4th grade, and some of them will even be at 1st grade level. How are you going to teach all of these kids in your classroom if you're a teacher? You can't. You just you try to hit the middle, somewhere between 3 and 4, and then the kids who are actually at 5th and 6th grade are bored out of their skull, and the kids who are at 1st grade still have no clue what's going on and will eventually drop out. That's not an ideal situation. But what you can do is to do either this with technology. So put them in a classroom 1 hour a day in front of a tablet with educational software. This software will very quickly catch up on where this particular student is at and teach her or him at her or his exact level. That means they suddenly got a teacher, each one of them, sort of, automatic teacher.
More dynamic teaching.
Yeah. And we know, so they'll go 7 hours a day to this boring school that doesn't quite work. 1 hour a day, they'll actually learn a lot of stuff. Over a year, this will cost $31 more per kid per year. You both need to buy the tablet, and they'll share with a lot of other kids. You need to buy maybe solar panels to have to recharge them. And you need to buy an extra classroom to have the tablet schooling. You need to have lockers so they don't get stolen at night. You need to teach there's a lot of things that go in there. We've tried to take care of all of this. There's a lot of randomized controlled trial studies on this. So what it shows is $31 in cost. The net benefit is after 1 year, each of the students on average have learned as much as they normally would in 3 years. You've just tripled the efficiency of school. This is outstanding. So how much is that worth in money? And that's, of course, what we try to do with cost and benefit. The cost is $31. The benefit is that these kids have higher test scores, which we know very reliably turn into higher wages in their adult lives because they're more productive.
Yeah.
And so over their lifetime, these kids will on average make $20,000 more. Now, remember, much of this is 3, 4, 5 decades out. So if you discount all of this back till today, what is it worth in today's money? The answer is about $2,000. But spending $31 to do $2,000 worth of good is a fantastically good investment. This is one of the things that Prime Minister Modi definitely should be doing.
Yeah.
And we've actually convinced several states. So Malawi, for instance, in Africa is now doing this across their first to fourth year. And it's fairly cheap. It's actually turning out to be even cheaper than they thought. And it's incredibly powerful. You can also do it in another way that Pradham in India is doing, which is to actually select the kids out. So one hour a day, you take all the ones that are at first grade into the same room and teach them. But it gets this awkward social situation that you get the 6-year-old and the 12-year-old in the same room, and it becomes very obvious who's sort of behind. And there's some very bad outcomes. It's not quite as efficient, but it's also much cheaper. So you could also do. The second thing you can do is to have structured teacher plans. So basically make sure, because most teachers are not all that great, but if you give them structured teacher plans, tell you, this week we're going to do fractions, and tell them how to walk through a school lesson. Now, some of them are going to ignore it. Not all of them are going to be great, but it will make the teachers better. And that's great because it's very, very cheap to do. And you'll also send them text messages. Oh, this week we're doing fractions. Get them more excited about this. We know from a lot of randomized controlled trials that this is a very cheap way to make teachers smarter, better, more effective to students. So this will cost about $8 per kid, but it'll make them almost $1,000 better off in their adult lives. So again, benefit cost ratio of more than 100. So for every rupee spent, you'll do more than 100 rupees of benefit. This is the kind of thing that you should do in education. There's a lot of things you shouldn't do in education because you can waste a lot of money doing it really badly. But these are two of the best ways to spend money. So that was on the education bit, the economic side. Let me just
on the
yes.
Education front,
Yes.
I just wanted to point out to you that what we were dealing with before and what Modi has changed. For example, earlier we had no detention policy. For example, if a child fails in a class, he will be promoted to next class, irrespective of his performance. So imagine from there and from focus on inputs. But now we are focusing on outcomes, and we have, outlawed the no detention policy. We have removed it. So these are the basic things that we had to deal with. Of course, these are very good steps that you have recommended. But yeah,
and one of the important bits is that most of education systems, not surprisingly, are run by teachers because they are the ones we pay in the millions. There are millions of teachers. These are the guys who make our schools run. That's wonderful. I'm very, very happy that there are all these teachers out there. But obviously, it's hard for a teacher not to worry about, well, I would like more income. I'd also like to be more important. There's a lot of things I'd like. And one of the things is, most of the things that you do to make life better for teachers don't actually translate very well into student outcomes. And so we have to be very, very careful to say, so for instance, the putting in a tablet in the schoolroom makes a lot of teachers uncomfortable because obviously they're going to feel a little bit like, are you trying to replace me? And I get that. That's why we're only talking about 1 hour a day and the teacher will still be in the room to take any problems that come up. But it's really a way to make sure that you get all your teachers on board with this. But what you have to be very careful about is You're possibly not going to get the best advice on how to spend more money in school from the teachers who obviously also have a personal interest. You need to look at what the researchers tell you are the best investments. And that's where we really need to make sure we spend it effectively.
And spending on this tablet thing will, of course, force these teachers also to introduce kids to AI.
Yeah.
Chat GPT and all these Grok and all these platforms that are coming up, and they can actually make them more, curiosity oriented. They can
Possibly.
they can ask questions and they can interact with the AI.
Yeah.
And the teacher can actually clear doubts and if there is any discrepancy or anything.
So my worry about these things. So again, I'm the data guy. I want to see some data on this, and we haven't seen it yet. So do you remember there was a very, very popular sort of social movement 2 decades ago, one laptop per child?
Yeah.
It was sort of argued that this was the best thing we could possibly do. Imagine getting a cheap laptop, was the idea, to every school child in the world. And he or she will have access to all the information in the world. It just sounded like a great idea.
People didn't know what screen time does.
all the people in the rich world thought, oh, this is great. And we gave money to it. Was only sort of 15 years later, we actually did the study of it. Turns out, so Peru was one of the countries that did this most. Turns out that has absolutely no impact. It probably destroys your attention in classroom. But, fundamentally, if you give a kid a computer, what are they going to do? This is not rocket science. They're going to play games. They're going to watch movies. They're going to watch porn on this. And they're not going to be engaged in the teaching in the classroom. This is not rocket science. No. And so while I really agree with your idea of I would love the AI bit to work this way, it could also just take them into a dark hole and they'll never come out again. I just want to see the data there. That's why I keep saying we need to look at the data. It's not like there's not a lot of things that we know work. Why don't we do that first? And then, of course, let's make all the studies on AI and all that stuff. And remember, again, the teachers are going to be much, much more worried about being replaced by AI. So I wish you good luck in convincing the teachers about it. But the fundamental point is, let's make sure we do these simple things. So let me just tell you the other simple thing that we could do with maternal and newborn health.
Yeah.
So, obviously there's a lot of different health challenges. I'm just going to look at one of these. So in India every year, 25,000 moms die in childbirth. About 600,000 kids, so 6 lakh kids die each year in their first 28 days on Earth. And most of this is related to the birth part. We know how to fix much of this. It's simply making sure that you have emergency obstetric care for moms. So that means getting moms into birth facilities to give care.
By the way, Modi government has a scheme on that also.
Yes.
And
Modi has
they are giving economic incentives to give birth in hospitals.
And that is great. The problem then is you need to make sure that those birth facilities actually have the emergency obstetric care. So there's a little bit of cost there, but you need to get a lot more cost to do all these simple things. So let me give you one example, birth asphyxiation. So a lot of kids, I never knew this before I went into this whole rabbit hole, but about at least 700,000 kids basically come out of the mom and don't breathe, and they die each year. And this happens even in Europe. So about 80% of all kids come out and they just start screaming right away. The 15% you need to give them the slap in the back and then they start screaming and then they're good to go. But the last 5% don't start breathing. And you need to have positive air pressure. So you put a mask over them and pump air into their tiny little lungs, and then they can start breathing. Now, not everyone is going to survive this, but most will if you have the right equipment. This is this plastic thing costs like $65 and you can use it for 3 years. In an average hospital, it'll save 20 kids. So, that's $5 a kid if you count in the nurse that will have to know how to do this. It's incredibly cheap. But a lot of places around the poor part of the world don't have this. Why? Because most doctors don't think this is all that interesting. They want the big MRI machine. If you've ever watched Monty Python, the machine that says pling, have you? I encourage everyone, also your listeners, it's a great thing. So basically, John Cleese and all the other guys, they're doctors in there, and then the hospital administrators in there, and they want to show all their machines, and they sort of, something is missing. Oh, the mother. They're so excited about all these machines. And then they want to show him the most expensive machine they have, and which is the machine that says pling. And that's, of course, that's the whole joke of this, that they're so excited about these machines that they forget that, it's actually about making sure you have a safe birth. And obviously this is parody and, it's comedy. But there's also something true to this, that these very basic things have very little sort of, what is that word? It has very little gravity for most people. No, we want the MRI machine, not these, this cheap plastic thing that's going to
want fancy toys.
They want the fancy stuff. And so we need to make sure, and that's much harder to do, to make sure that you actually have a clean birth environment, that you have these emergency obstetric care, that you have repeated exercises. One of the things I talk to some of the doctors who do this, if you don't get repeated exercises, you're afraid of, these babies that come out, especially if they have problems, they're very, very fragile. Yeah. And you have to sort of, within a minute, decide, I'm going to give them heart massage, which could kill them, but could also save them. And so you sort of hope that it goes over, you hope that it'll start breathing, and then it's too late. You really need to, sort of get them into the routine of doing this. So there's a lot of simple things you need to do. So we estimate the total cost of this for the world would be about $5 billion. Remember, a lot of this is cost for the mother, because if you get moms into facilities, they actually have to stay there a couple of days, which means they'll have to forego their income for a couple of days. Many other places, they'll just, they'll give birth and then get right back to work. So there's a real cost, about $5 billion in total. But the benefit is that we could save 166,000 moms across the world, and we could save 1.2 million kids. This is just outstanding. So we estimate for every rupee spent, we could do 87 rupees of good. Again, if you want to do good in the world, why is this not one of your top priorities? So my book is really literally filled with these 12 amazing examples that show you, here's how you can do it for education. Here's how you can do it for maternal and newborn health. And just to give you a few of the other examples, obviously, as we talked about before with agriculture, you need to get agriculture to be better. And again, just like we talked about with climate change, the best way is through research and development. Make sure you pay more researchers to find better ways to get higher yields in the future. This is very, very small bits across the world, but it just simply makes all of agriculture much, much more productive. Another thing is obviously immunization. Another thing is, this is a fun one. Most people on the planet die from heart disease and from cancer. Yeah. So it's about a third and a quarter of all people that die.
This is a big problem in India now.
Huge problem. So, for all old people, this is what you should worry about. But the problem is that fixing cancer is incredibly expensive. Fixing heart disease turns out to be incredibly cheap. And so if you're a nice guy, you would tend to say, heart disease and cancer, both problems. We should give equal amounts to both of them. No, you should not. You should give all the money first to heart disease, because we know that if you get on these hypertension reducing medications, so basically get your blood pressure down, it means that you can live about 6 years longer, because you don't get a heart attack or a stroke quite as early on. This is a great way, and they're off patent, and they're probably all produced in India by now. And this could save about 500 to 1 million people more each and every year. Why aren't we doing that? And again, we look across a vast range of other things. One of the biggest problems in the world from disease point of view is that we get ever more psychological diseases, partly because we're now so healthy that we can start worrying about our psychological health. But it turns out that some of these things you can't treat very easily, but schizophrenia is actually one of those diseases that you can cure very cheaply with basic pills.
Is it?
Yeah. So, we know, again, I'm not promising you 100%, but you can cure a lot of people with very, very simple medications. We should do that. We also find that that's a great way to help people. So again, if you start looking at what's the cost, what's the benefit, you start realizing, some of the stuff we do in climate is incredibly stupid. Some of it is actually smart, like innovation. And some of these things, like education done the right way, or maternal and newborn health done the right way, or agricultural research and development, or as we just talked about with hypertension medication, incredibly cheap, incredibly smart things. And my simple point to the world is just, why don't we start there?
Yeah. I mean, what I love about your books is that they are filled with data, and they are backed with so much extensive research. With this book, Best Things First, with each chapter you have done so much research with all these people who are involved in this, economists, that everything is accounted for. For example, the one example that you gave about even heart diseases, about nurses, you have even taken into account the cost of nurse 10 minutes time. So this is how extensive this thing is.
So, and we should just say, I haven't done any of that. I'm just the guy who sit here and talk in front of your microphone. There's a lot of smart people who have actually done that, and they
each chapter is by different set of people, and they have done excellent research. So and this you have presented all that very well. So thank you so much, sir. I hope that you get to talk to the people in the government in India.
Yeah.
Because
can you get me Modi's phone number?
No, I wish. Otherwise, I would have called him here also.
Yes.
But I hope if somebody listens to this in the PMO and in the government, they definitely should talk to you, and it will do us a lot of good. So
it will.
Thank you so much.